Good morning, everyone. It's Shelley Meadows. I'm a partner with Navigation Consulting and Training.
And I'm Martin Franchi, the other founding partner.
Welcome to our Challenge and Change webinar series, Transitioning to the New Normal. Part one, we're going to be talking about workplace health and safety changes. With the stay-at-home requirements easing, we need to start thinking about a safe return to work. So that's what we'll be covering today. Thank you for joining us. Bear with us from the outset. I'm going to say we are, like everyone else, working remotely. So it may not be as smooth as usual. Martin and I are used to presenting live, and we have those visual cues, and we don't have them here. So it may be a bit choppy at times. So our apologies if that happens. Martin's just going to do a little housekeeping.
Yeah, we're practicing the extreme social distancing. We're about 45 kilometers apart as opposed to 2 meters. But a couple of things that I just wanted to sort of point out with this platform, which is somewhat unique. One of the things is that there is a video component that we can start up, but we found that there's like a delay and a lag between the audio and the video, so it was a little bit distracting. So this entire presentation is just going to be an audio-only presentation.
So before we start into the formal component, one of the things we want to say is what this looks like from a workplace health and safety standpoint will be very unique to your own organization. We really are in uncharted territory here. None of us in our lifetime have had this experience where we've had to sort of shut down work, go back and restart. So it will depend on your industry, what will work for you. However, there are some common elements that are relevant regardless of what industry you're in. That are sort of, we call the foundation or fundamentals that we will share with you. As part of this, our learning objectives today is to share ideas to help you navigate through this very complicated and changing time, as well as to understand those foundational principles for success. So since the state of emergency was declared, we really have been in this period of unprecedented change and uncertainty. So let's focus on what we do know. What we do know is that the old normal is likely gone. I'm not sure we're ever going to be able to return to that. The new normal that we're experiencing is still undefined and continuing to evolve. So until a vaccine or better treatment protocols are established, we're in that state. And when that will happen really is anyone's guess at this point. We could have subsequent waves. Actually, this morning, there was a perfect example in Hamilton, New Brunswick. There's a doctor who traveled out of province, came back, was supposed to self-isolate, didn't do that, and went back to work for a period of 2 weeks. Now, businesses that just opened last Friday in Hamilton, New Brunswick are having to close again. And in the broader New Brunswick, those that were opening, just on the precipice of reopening within the coming days, now will no longer be able to open. They're sort of rescaling back. They're reopening. So we are subject to change. So what does it all mean? There may be a real shift in workplace priorities. So the Human Resource Professionals Association did a survey of HR professionals, and they've said they believe that there will be a fundamental shift, that health and safety will become a priority, as well as mental health as a result of COVID-19. The other thing we know for sure is we're going to need to be adaptable and agile. The New Brunswick case is a perfect example of why we may think that we're going forward and we may have to take a few steps back. Throughout this process, planning and communication is really important. That is one of those foundational elements that we will talk about. It'll come up a lot of times in the presentation. Sometimes the best laid plans don't always work. So be willing to accept that and know that you may have to pivot back.
So the first thing we want to just throw up before we get into any kind of examples or ideas is just looking at some of the language in the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And I know the language throughout the jurisdictions of Canada and federally tend to emulate each other. And a lot of it with the employer's duties is to provide a safe workplace. But something that's somewhat unique in Ontario is there's this clause, 25(2)H, that talks about the fact that the employer has to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstance of protection of worker. And the key thing there is the reasonable. My definition of reasonable might be different from your definition of reasonable. And ultimately, we have to rely on the definition of reasonable from the Ministry of Labor inspector if they get called in. So what we're trying to establish today, or give you some ideas, is looking at ways to, one, fulfill your regulatory requirements for your workplace, as like for employers and even as other workers, to make sure that the workplace is safe, but also thinking about the employer's not necessarily responsibility so much, but it's like a really good practice to say, let's create an environment that people want to come back to and they feel safe in coming back to, and then setting up protocols and procedures that way. So the other thing we're hoping is that, you know, you create an environment that people will feel safe to come back to, and no one will invoke their right to refuse unsafe work. That whole procedure, while I could go over it, it's like almost, it's an excellent source for another webinar, but it's not necessarily complex, but it's hopefully something everyone's aware of, but we'll visit that at another date. Unfortunately, the other thing too, health and safety under normal circumstances is now more important more than ever. So as we move forward, we're going to the next slide.
Excellent, thanks, Martin. So one of the most significant changes that may come as part of the health and safety reprioritization, I always trip over that word, is a new way of thinking. So we could potentially see a fundamental shift in commercial real estate as we revisit office trends. So the trend over the past few years towards densification and open office space and shared spaces, we may see that change. We might see that move out of high towers and urban centers to lower rise suburban locations. It's kind of part of a centralization, decentralization trend or expanding the tract that we have seen with businesses over time. I kind of joke, it's like some of our clothing sizes when we get out of isolation, all the bread we've been baking, we all may need a little more room by the time we come out of isolation. So I think of it as like old clothes coming back in fashion. So space is the new fashion. It's now back. But keep in mind, it's not just about separation and distance alone. We know that hand washing and distance are sort of the key controls that we have to mitigate the risk. But there are many other areas that we can rethink in order to minimize the risk to our workers as they return to the workplace. So we've put together a list of different areas that we've identified that you could consider. By no means is this an exhaustive list. Think about this more as a springboard to help you focus and generate your own ideas as well as you're coming up with your plans for returning to work. Keep in mind, there is no magic bullet. There is no one size fits all. And as I said before, it ultimately depends on your unique workplace and the applicable regulations if you're in or outside of Ontario or you're federally regulated. As you go, you'll find that, or based on your industry, some things will work better than others, and some simply just may not work or not even be possible, depending on your circumstances. What is for certain is a multi-pronged approach will likely be required to address the virus before workers can safely return to work. So it's not just throw a mask at it and you're done. You've got to think about various areas. One of the things that we've talked about is that we're all being very reactive. So we're having to scramble to put this in place versus proactive. So I encourage you, as you're coming up with your plans for return to work, to think proactively as well for the future. There are going to be other viruses. There are still colds and flus that increases absenteeism. And you want to think about how you might change to sort of mitigate those things going forward in the future. Underlying all of these sort of ideas, there is what we talked about, those foundational blocks in order to successfully navigate through this unprecedented time. We'll touch more on each of these towards the end of the presentation. You'll notice communication support is highlighted in red because I really view this as the cornerstone to success. That is what is going to be essential through all of this.
Right, and just before we get into any specific examples or ideas that we've seen throughout industries, I wanted to sort of just reinforce an ideology that is in occupational health and safety when you're talking about mitigating hazards or trying to control them. There's this ideology here called the hierarchy of controls, where there's sort of three areas that you look at. It starts with at the source, along the path, and at the worker. And ideally, when you're trying to deal with anything in your workplace, creating like a safe work environment, is that you try to remove the hazard at the source. And since today we're talking about, the COVID-19 being the hazard, and ideally there is a vaccine that it sort of eliminates it or removes it, that would be the perfect at the source example. Unfortunately, that's 8 months, a year away, who knows, right? But the other idea is just to try to find better solutions to mitigate the exposure to any hazard. So it starts with the source, and then you move to along the path, which is some barrier. Thinking of like old school gas stations with the plexiglass, which you may have seen if you've gone into grocery stores or any kind of retail environments. And then finally, it's protection at the worker, which is sort of the last resort, the personal protective equipment, or PPE as it's well known. But anyway, we're going to look at some of these sort of solutions, and they may fall into any one of these sort of categories. And you might want to sort of utilize more than one. If you're only looking at PPE, really need to think about doing it along with another sort of component, something along the path or something like that. Anyway, so we're going to keep going with our slides, and we're going to look at some specific type of examples that you might be able to implement at your workplace.
So we'll start with remote access or de-densification of the workplace. So there's really two ways that you can de-densify. And de-densifying is sort of the closest that we get to at the source by keeping people apart. You can either have more space or fewer people. So clearly more space that I referred to before is a longer term prospect. Redesign itself, I know it's the last bullet on the slide, investing for the longer term. We will talk about that as its own topic as well, but it is part of de-densifying. So to the extent that you can, the best we kind of have is continue to encourage remote access or working from home. So as you go through that, do you have a remote work policy in place? Hopefully 2 months in, you do. Some people had it in place before. It was really meant to be temporary. You may need to look at, do you have to revisit it? Or if you don't have one, you're in this now for a bit longer term. So you may want to think about actually developing one in writing. When you're going through introducing people back, seek out worker preferences. So some of us can't wait to get back into the workplace, and we have interruptions at home. We may not have a great office set up. There's mental health concerns too about being isolated at home and not back in the workplace. On the flip side, there are also concerns about returning to work, particularly around mental health, concern for physical safety as well. Re-entry anxiety is something that I've heard talked about that will likely exist for many people. So we need to seek out who might be looking forward to coming back and who might want to continue working from home more. The other thing is, as you have people working from home, the aches and pains, I know for me, are certainly starting to set in. You don't have your great chair and your great desk set up. So ergonomic assessments is something that you might want to consider as well. Or equipment allowances. So can you offer something to your employees that are continuing to work from home that they can get some equipment that will help them work better? We are aware there's free virtual home assessments that are now being offered by the occupational health clinics for Ontario workers. It's often known as OCAL. It's a matter of a simple email, and then you can sign up to get a free virtual home office assessment if that's something that would interest you and help your workers out. The other thing to keep in mind is supports. So as we reopen, it's pretty sure at this point, it seems that childcare and camps aren't going to be reopening at the same time. So you need to consider those supports that might be needed for people that have childcare or elder care commitments, that it will be a challenge for them to transition back until everything is open. Next is staggering work hours and rotating shifts. That does dovetail into access logistics, so Martin will touch on it as well. But it does also de-densify. We had an example, one that was an extreme example, and we will talk about being creative. There was a water treatment plant in Brandon, Manitoba. They happened to have a pandemic plan in place ahead of time, so they were able to do this. But they had a group of 9 people, that sequestered on site 24/7 for a period of 28 days. And then they had a subsequent group of 9 that would rotate in. And that group self-isolated at home for the 2 weeks prior to them entering the workplace. So there's obviously an extreme example. We can't all set up on-site trailers and facilities, but that was how in an essential service, how they managed it. And we thought that was a very creative way of managing the risk. So Martin, over to you more on access logistics.
Right. So with access logistics, we're looking more at getting your workforce into the office, right, or into your work environment. So a lot of you may be leasing spaces in buildings, or if you're very lucky, you actually control the space you're in. But either way, you'll have to think about how do you get people in, contactless access, the reprogramming of elevators. Again, if it's in a large building, these aren't things that you might be doing, but you'll be working with the property management company or the landlord, right? So some things you'll need to liaison with the property management company, some things you'll be able to deal with on your own, right? Or looking at it in like the separate entrance exit, if you're lucky enough to have two entrances into your workspace, maybe designate one as the entrance and one as the exit. You're trying to eliminate bottlenecks, right? And people passing through that kind of stuff. Shelley will talk next more about the inside of your workplace, but this is more looking at just getting people in. The last sort of point on this slide, which isn't necessarily your responsibility, but thinking of transportation plans of getting people to your workplace, right? If that's something that you find is doable or something that people are raising concerns of taking public transit, I could sort of think about in Toronto with being on the buses or the subway. Again, it could be sort of thinking outside the box and going way above and beyond and trying to create an environment where people feel safe at your workplace or getting there.
Yeah, Martin, I think that was a good point. The elevators was one that kind of surprised me, is that they really are programmed to have the maximum number of people in the space. And now we need them to be doing the opposite. So something we maybe hadn't thought about. So as I'll go on next to space redesign. Yeah.
Just for a sec, I was going to say that one of the key things, just from a housekeeping perspective, is if you've gone back into the slide presentation and you're not seeing us changing our slides, if you click on the very bottom right corner where it says presenter is here, you can get caught back up. I noticed that sometimes you can go back and you don't get the flow that we're doing.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Space redesign is the next one. So when we talk space redesign, we're talking about your layout and use of the space. Many of us are used to, at this point, floor markings, which notate the 6-foot distance. We hope that that doesn't change and someone says, oh no, it's 10 or 12 feet that we should be keeping apart. So keep in mind, 6 feet is a minimum. If you in your workplace want to do a farther distance, just to be cautious, you can do that. One-way directional markers is another thing that we have seen. Keep in mind when you're doing these things, though, that placement is important, either placement or training. So I've seen at the grocery store, I can't tell you how many times, people just don't see the markings on the floor. We just don't normally look down, is really the case. So if you're in a workplace and it's only your workers coming in, you can train them to look for those markers. But if you've got clients or customers coming in and out, you either have to have someone notify them and tell them, or put it in a place where they actually will see it. Another thing we're seeing, open space layouts obviously become significant challenges in this environment. So it's, do you move the desks further apart? Do you put dividers or barriers? Do you only put people at alternating desks? We may see a return of the dreaded cubicle that some of us grew up with the walls blocking us off so we can't see our neighbors. I know in my husband's law firm, as an example, a few years ago, they installed new desks for the admin staff that actually had plexiglass barriers. And at the time, they complained, nobody liked them, so they got taken down. Now, thankfully, they held on to them, and everybody is now asking them to be reinstalled. So back they go. So it's that return again. We will see, I think, a decrease. We have to see a decrease in communal and desk sharing. Some people call it hoteling space, in favor of dedicated private space. The transient WeWork is a bit of a challenge as well. The key here is really the fewer people sharing a space, the better, whether it's at the same time or it's one after the other. Think about how you can limit the number of people that are touching one space. Challenge with common areas. So think about your meeting rooms, kitchen or lunch areas, your coffee rooms, lobbies. What are you going to do there? Do you limit access? reduce numbers, have a maximum capacity? Do you put single tables? So you need to think about the protocols that are required. I won't name who said it to me, but there was someone whose reaction was, that's fine. No one gets access to the kitchen coffee. That's it. It's done. You can't even go into the kitchen. And Martin's going to talk to that.
Yes, when I heard that, I was like, oh, no, Shelley, there's a regulation that in Ontario, the regulation that deals with actually a majority of us, the industrial regulations. It sounds odd. It was actually set up more for factories and foundries, but it covers office, it covers retail, education. It's one of those things, but there is a section in the regulation that talks about the fact that if you have more than 35 workers or you deal with specific chemicals, you have to have a place for eating, for food consumption. It doesn't stipulate that it has to have a fridge and a Keurig coffee maker, but it has to be a place where you eat. And, you know, going and saying, well, we can just all eat at our desks, that's like another whole conversation we should have why you shouldn't do that. But it's just keep in mind there's a regulation specifying you have to have an eating area. Anyways, the next topic that we're going to look at is cleaning and sanitation. Hygiene plan. Who would have thought that we have to think about having a hygiene plan? Granted, I mean, health, I was supposed to say healthcare, you know, food prep areas, restaurants. I mean, they've all been doing it for eons, but, you know, other industries are kind of like, what are we doing? So, you know, you have to think about this kind of stuff as well. You put some kind of plan in writing, what protocols are in place, how often, who's doing it, looking at high touch pointing areas. Maybe you have a tracking board or sign-off sheets. I'm thinking about if you've gone into a restaurant bathroom and there's like the thing on the wall that has people checking it every hour. Like those are the type of things you might want to look at. The other thing was, Shelley was saying just a bit earlier, was if you're having multiple use spaces, like if people are still sharing a desk, let's say, are you looking at sanitizing the stations in between use, right? Are you training your staff, or are we all sort of coming together to wipe things down after we've used them? Or if you're, again, lucky enough to have a third party coming in to be doing some kind of cleaning and sanitization at night, are you increasing that? Are you having them come in earlier throughout the day? It obviously will have some kind of cost impact, but that's what you want to sort of think about. How can you sort of look at touch points within your office? Some other solutions are installing UV lights to sort of kill bacteria over the night, but it's all of that kind of thing you want to look at. The other one is a little bit controversial, I guess, maybe like having, if you've had a dishwasher and you have communal coffee cups, maybe you're looking at disposable or biodegradable, or maybe you're sort of assigning people, this is your mug, you must keep control of your mug. And then that's the type of approach we're looking at. I know it sounds a little odd to sort of have that kind of approach, but it's a way to sort of keep things that we're using to ourselves.
I'd also like to point out, Martin, I know you talked about the hygiene plan being common in some settings, not others. Similar to hand washing stations and sanitizing, particularly in office and retail, we may not be used to it, but you may think about, do you need to put some sanitizer near those common touch points, like the photocopier, if anyone still uses one of those, the coffee pot, that fridge access, if you're continuing those. And think about what you might need to be doing now to also ensure that you get the appropriate supplies and hand sanitizers, as we have gone through periods where those can be difficult to obtain. So Martin, I'll turn you over to technology solutions now.
Yeah, so there's other places where you can find solutions, and I know people are kind of thinking, uh-oh, technology, large investment of cash that I don't necessarily have, but you have to look at it as an investment, right? It's something that will pay dividends off in the end. The very first one I could think of is sort of installing motion detectors, right? So if you're going into a room, lights automatically come off. If there's no movement in the room for a period of time, they go off. That has probably been around in a lot of places already because it does save money from an environmental perspective. But looking at that, is there more technology like that you can install in your workplace so you're not having to open doors, turn on lights, that kind of stuff, right?
Just smart voice and smart device are good there as well.
Yeah, without using input devices like keyboards and mice, it's like you could be using different technology as well. The other thing you might want to look at is air filtration. Your HVAC system, not going to go into a lot of detail here, but your HVAC system, if it runs more often with different sort of filtration, it's all the better. It's always been a good thing to do anyway, but it does come to incur some extra cost. And then we look at technology infrastructure. If you're setting up more servers because you're having a virtual network, that is also a challenge because, you know, a lot of us were caught off guard and it was a quick rush to set these things up and there was a slight server shortage for a while. But these type of things are stuff that you want to look at from a technological point of view, and they might be useful.
One of the things I also just wanted to add, just because you said the air filtration, Martin, was standing water and the risk of bacteria buildup, because we've had these buildings shut for such a prolonged period of time. We haven't had that before. So think
Good
about
point.
your restart procedures. We don't want to make our workers sick from something not COVID because we've been shut down. So when you restart, make sure that your HVAC systems, I think you said water coolers, can be a problem.
Yeah, water coolers, humidifiers, dehumidifiers, anywhere there's standing water is a problem. Usually it's fine, but a shorter period of time, but something like this might have been a problem. Also, maybe your water cooler that's been sitting there for a couple of months in an office space. So things like that you want to look at. I mean, the HVAC system is probably dealt with by your property management company, but keep it in mind.
I can only imagine what we're going to return to, some of the kitchens in the
fridges.
The foods that were left in the fridges. I'm thinking of my kids' high school locker and how awful it may be when they go back. Next, that leads us into health protocols. So sick leave policies and health check protocols. What do you want to consider there? So when you're venturing into this area of health protocols, I'd say very much consult with HR and legal counsel, as there may be privacy and confidentiality concerns, as well as requirements under employment standards that you may or may not be able to do certain things. Think about your sick leave policy. Do you have it paid or unpaid? It's how do you encourage your people to truly stay home when they are sick? I will admit, I have been guilty of this in the past. I have gone into work sick. I now get that that was not the smartest decision, and it was maybe a little bit selfish because I felt like my work was so important it had to be done, or I felt guilty that I'd be letting people down. So I think we need to reframe that and try to encourage people, if you really are sick, stay home. Your coworkers do not want what you have, especially if it is COVID-19. Sick leave policies, will you require medical clearance? So if someone comes down with COVID-19, do you require them to have 2 negative tests before they return? That's something to consider. Temperature checks, virus swabs. If we get that rapid, we're lucky enough to get that rapid testing. Are you in an industry that you will want your workers to be tested that way? Also knowing where you have vulnerable or at-risk staff that might have pre-existing conditions that would put them in a high-risk category, or they live with someone who's in a higher risk category. So when you think about, sort of looping back to what I said about the return to work and who might return and who might not, try to keep that into consideration. Incident and outbreak response plans. Some people have them, some people don't. We definitely need them now. So if that's where someone comes into the workplace and they suddenly come down sick, I had that with the Norwalk virus, and there was no plan. So you want to have, what's the plan for isolating, offering assistance. So get them away from people, how you get them either home or to the hospital if they need to do that. There will likely be a requirement for some level of contact tracing. So what other staff have they been in touch with? You do, as an employer, have an obligation to communicate to workers about risks and to protect them. So you'll need to come up with those protocols and communication plan in that regard.
The next topic we're going to touch on is the dreaded PPE, personal protective equipment. Just wanted to sort of, again, reiterate that this is sort of the last line of defense. And we can at least start with face coverings, masks, face shields, whatever. They may be useful. The one thing to be really aware of is that the only type of mask that protects you as an individual from any kind of viral issue or the viruses itself is an N95 mask, right? And that unfortunately needs specific training, needs to be fitted and AirFit test fitted that way. So why is the government talking about, or why are we hearing suggestions to wear face coverings at all, about, you know, bandanas, scarves, non-surgical masks? That's more about we being proactive, protecting other people in our workplace, right? Stopping the spread of the droplets as we talk or cough. But I mean, it's something you have to consider. Are you going to have that as a priority in your office space that everyone wears, thinking about clients, customers coming in? I know they're not fun to wear at all, but it's one of those things you can consider. The other thing, like back to training, you know, you have to think about when you're using these things, teaching people how to wear them properly, how to dispose of them properly. And then when you set up policies to deal with it, like making sure everyone's aware. So it's the training comes into play here.
Super, thanks, Martin. And the last sort of detailed area that we're going to talk about before we get into the foundation that we've referred to is mental health. So mental health is equally as important to physical health and safety. Mental health issues are undoubtedly on the rise with what we've been through. Some people are fine. Don't get me wrong. Some people are loving being at home. Other people experience fear, anxiety. It can cause stress, these are often impacts from prolonged isolation. Even depression, I think, will be on the rise. We will see that. So as people return to work, and even now, mental health supports are critical through this time of uncertainty and change. So look for those supports that you have. There's lots of supports available. Your employee assistance plan, peer support are good, friends, professionals. There are hotlines available and clinics or therapists available for those that need it. Keep an eye on your staff for signs that they might be struggling throughout the process. Any kind of change in behavior or withdrawal might indicate that they're going through a time, anger as well. That's a whole nother webinar as well. Other concurrent issues, keep in mind, may not resolve at the same time. So as they're coming back, people are still facing additional challenges on top of the stress of transitioning back to work. So there's the childcare or financial stresses that are still going to be ongoing. So we have to be mindful of that. Also keep in mind, everyone responds in their own way. Some people will need more support and people will need support in different ways. So it's really important to be understanding and empathetic throughout this process. The other thing we've put here is violence and harassment. Yes, it still exists. Workplace harassment is still alive and well, even in a virtual environment. And again, we will be doing a webinar, I think, for sure on this one. But it's a time, so I won't get into too much detail about it, but it might be time to dust off those policies and do some retraining around harassment. People are short-tempered these days. Temper can build to anger, can build to harassment. Plus, we're a lot more casual in the workplace. So we might say things or do things we maybe wouldn't have before. The other thing in mental health is domestic violence. I think there's an awareness that this has increased during this time of isolation. So there may be challenges in this area, and there are responsibilities for employers around this once they become aware of it. So key to all this, and we have said it before, but again, we'll reinforce it. So fundamental in times of uncertainty and change at any time is to be adaptable and agile now more than ever, because as I said, the situation will continue to evolve. We might get those waves. We might be going through what New Brunswick is going through with a bit of we're allowed a bit more freedom and then it's going to be taken away again. Take the time to find what works for you and others that don't, and don't be afraid to course correct. We talk a lot about, in the mental health arena, about individual resilience. Here we really need organizational resilience or corporate resilience as we go through this, because it is really unprecedented change for us.
Yeah, and going on to creativity, which I think we've sort of spoke of throughout the presentation, is being creative and finding solutions and looking at stuff. Talking to your frontline workers, because they are the best source of information when they're having to deal with stuff. They probably have pretty good solutions that they want to share with, but collaborate, right? I mean, utilize your joint health and safety committee if you have one, or health and safety representative. Just talk amongst the group and then try to find solutions together to going forward to creating that work environment that would be great for everyone to be back in. And even though we assume that we're hoping that everyone will come back to work, you know, may still be people working virtually on off days or whatever. So as Shelley was saying, that the virtual work world or the landscape, that's still going to be out there, right? And it's something to keep in mind and consider. The next slide that we have is policies, protocols, training, right? So we've sort of said this as well. It's like you're going to have to revisit policies, tweak them, create new ones if you haven't had them before, and create protocols and put them in place. And again, educate everyone. The training is so important, and it's also part of the requirement under the Act that if there's any changes in the workplace, that the employer has to make sure that all the workers are trained and knowledgeable in this kind of stuff. So you want to look at that and keep it going. The other thing that think we mentioned a couple times, but like all the ideas that we talked about are not a definitive list. Things will change. Protocols that we're even suggesting today, or we're seeing that's being practiced today, they may not be effective in a week or in 2 weeks. So you have to be aware and able to adapt and change and just be nimble. I don't want to use the word pivot, but it's out there too.
And I'd say reinforcement of the policy as well. It's a bit of a, it's something that drives me crazy. If you put in a policy, if you don't reinforce it, the policy isn't worth having put it in writing. So you really have to make sure that you reinforce that. Did you want to talk, Martin, about the permanent versus temporary, or do you want me to talk about that?
You can go on. You can talk about it.
So when you're doing the policies and training, think about whether you're going to put things in temporarily, or do you want to make these changes permanent? I try to sometimes find the good in the bad situations. And so there may be things that you either didn't have the time to do before, you put off, or you didn't do them because you thought they wouldn't be well received. That now, quite frankly, to put it bluntly, COVID has given you the opportunity to do it as the excuse. And then you can make that change permanent. So think about those things that you might not have had time for, or that you were hesitant to change, that now it's kind of the catalyst to push you forward to do that and make it either a permanent change in your culture.
As this has sort of dragged some industries into the future, and some people realize that it is possible to work remotely and still be productive. Yeah. Right. But it's the balance, right? So sometimes you do want to work remotely. Sometimes you want to come back into the workplace to collaborate and actually bounce ideas off each other.
Yeah. Yeah. But I always just look for the opportunity. Gives us a good excuse to do something else. Be supportive. So we have, again, talked about this through the mental health piece, but consider whether you designate a person, or I like the idea of a task force, because then you have a group minds think better than one. In order to come up with the ideas for transitioning back. Again, make sure those EAP, employee assistance plans, or mental health supports are really in place to support your workers, and listen to your workers. They will have the best ideas. One of the organizations that I heard about was doing, I think it's a best practice, they surveyed the workers throughout to involve them. So it was, how are you doing? What's working well for you? What's not working well for you? How do you think we're performing as an organization? What are we doing well? Because we have to have both positive and negative feedback. What do you think we're doing well, and what do you think we could do better? And so seek that input out. It really is important. And the bottom line to all of this is communicate, and then communicate again. I can't say it enough. Communication is perhaps the single most important thing for any organization. This is true under normal circumstances in any time of change, but is now more important than ever because we are under this unprecedented level of change. Even if you don't have all the answers, and you won't, and that's okay, don't be afraid to admit it. What people need now is strong, steady leadership. So even if it's saying, I know there's a problem, we are looking into it, and we're going to come up with a solution, that helps. Silence in this kind of environment can breed fear. It says that you don't know what you're doing, and it can cause people to lose confidence. So it really is important, I can't stress it enough, to keep those lines of communication open. Not just top down, but also bottom up. So you can help navigate through these challenging times successfully. So that ends our, I think,
formal component.
Now we are getting to the 45 minutes that we set. We are happy to stay on for questions. The session doesn't sort of drop dead at 10:45, so we're happy to stay on a little bit. We do have a hard exit by 11. If anyone has any questions that they would like to ask. And Martin, did you want to say a closing remark?
No, I think we kind of summed it up well, and I just keep again thinking, you articulated it. Don't be afraid to reevaluate anything that you try, because it's never perfect right from the onset, and that's actually part of your health and safety program, is to sort of keep evaluating any control you put in place. Is it working? Is it working well? Can we do it differently? So those are completely valid things, and you will not be perfect, and it's okay.
Before you get into the questions, because I see there are some, I have a joke of the day, because humor is important. So okay. This is a Billy Crystal joke that I heard this morning. Martin, did you hear about the claustrophobic astronaut?
I did not.
He just wanted a little more space. But
Nice.
Okay, go with the questions. Sorry.
Stick to your day job.
I will stick to my day job.
There is a couple questions that came up. One is, what is the role of the Joint Health and Safety Committee? And I kind of articulated a little bit that they're there to support you. They're a resource, usually filled with health and safety nerds like myself. They're a fantastic place to sort of get support. I mean, ultimately, they are there to audit your health and safety program in the workplace, and they have really two functions: to identify hazards and make recommendations to mitigate them. But use them in collaboration of trying to find things out.
And someone has asked whether we can provide the information about the free virtual ergonomic assessment. I've put up on our last slide, we've got all our contact information. So if you want that, I will respond to the person that asked that. But if anyone else wants that, please feel free to email us and we'll send you that email address so you can seek that out. Martin, work refusals. Can people refuse to come to work if they are just too scared to come in?
Ooh, that's a pretty complex question. I can say the short answer is unfortunately no. The whole work refusal process actually presents itself when you show up into a workspace or your workplace, and then we all have this right to refuse unsafe work. It's limited depending on your business, so a firefighter can't sort of show up and say, "I'm not going to go fight that fire; it's going to kill me." But unfortunately, if you're not at work, it's your responsibility to come into work, and then you can exercise your right to refuse unsafe work. But before that, like we were sort of talking about, maybe think of transportation solutions. So I can't sort of say I'm scared to get on the TTC, let's say, because I might catch the virus. So it's unfortunate the way it's worded now.
So Martin, if I'm an employer, I presume that as long as I've put sort of multiple controls in place, I've not just thrown a mask at it, as long as I've done, distancing and taken a multi-pronged approach to this, that I might be okay to sort of protect myself against a work refusal.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea is to come up with solutions to mitigate all this, right? So, yeah, going on the work refusal again, there was a few work refusals that were implemented. The MOL had a spike in them.
Ministry of Labor is MOL.
Sorry, yeah, Ministry of Labor, and MOL, as we affectionately call them. There were quite a few work refusals that were put out there, but none were sort of upheld, although there were some orders written.
This is at the beginning. This is at the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah, it was about the first 4 weeks that found out. So it was it's a little disheartening that, or not necessarily disheartening, but people are exercising it. But if you're putting protocols in place to protect everyone at the workplace, and I said ultimately it depends on what the Minister of Labor defines as reasonable, that's what you're looking at, and that's what will the ultimate decision of the inspector that sort of shows up. So I mean, I don't have a specific example of me dealing with an MOL inspector in this case, but I mean, the thought process is if you can place protocols in or think of solutions that will help, make an environment that's safe for everybody.
Okay, super. There's only one last question that I see. It's about the slides, and absolutely, we're happy to provide a copy of our slides to anyone if you are interested. Again, the person that asked will send it to you, and anyone else that is interested in a copy of the slides, please email us, and we're happy to send that along. But other than that, I don't think there's any more questions, so we will say thank you for attending today. I hope you all remain safe and healthy, both mentally and physically, throughout this challenging time, and enjoy your day and support each other.
Take care.
Thanks a lot.